There is a room inside Kensington Palace that most people will never see. It sits at the end of a corridor that the public tours don't reach, past the official portraits and the velvet ropes and the carefully arranged furniture that exists purely for display. The room itself is unremarkable in the way that private spaces often are, a little worn, a little lived in, bearing the kind of quiet that only accumulates over years of being left undisturbed. It was in this room, according to sources close to the royal household, that Prince William made a discovery that would quietly reshape the way he understood his own family. Not the family as the world sees it, the family as it actually was. What he found wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a secret bank account or a hidden will or a piece of paper that lawyers would need to examine. It was smaller than that, and far more dangerous. It was his mother's handwriting. Now, before we go any further, this story is built from what is known, what has been widely reported across years of royal coverage, and what has been thoughtfully pieced together through the kind of speculation that serious royal observers have engaged in since Diana's death. This is dramatized commentary. But the emotional truth at its center, that is harder to dismiss. Because William has spent decades carrying questions about his mother that no one in his family has ever fully answered. And the idea that Diana left answers behind, answers she trusted to paper rather than to people, is not merely dramatic invention. It is, by almost every account of who Diana was, exactly what she would have done. So, a room, a corridor, and a diary that wasn't supposed to be found. The sequence of events, as it has been reconstructed, began not with William, but with a renovation. Kensington Palace has undergone several rounds of updating over the past decade, and the process of clearing rooms, cataloging contents, and reorganizing storage has occasionally turned up items that were filed away decades ago and simply never retrieved. Royal household staff are trained to handle such discoveries carefully, to log, to preserve, to pass upward through the appropriate channels without reading, without speculating, without discussing. Most of the time, that system works exactly as intended. This time, it appears it worked a little too well, because what reached William's hands came through official channels, properly logged and properly sealed, which meant that when he opened it, he was entirely alone, no aide hovering nearby, no private secretary ready to manage the reaction. Just William, a sealed box that had been found during a clear-out of a storage space connected to Diana's former private rooms, and the growing realization that whatever was inside had been hidden deliberately. The box itself was not particularly remarkable. Dark green, small enough to carry under one arm, the kind of thing that might hold stationery or keepsakes. It was sealed with tape that had grown brittle with age. When William broke the seal, according to what has been shared in careful confidence by those familiar with the situation, what he found inside were several notebooks. Not just one, several, different sizes, different covers, the kind of assortment that suggests someone who wrote regularly and privately over an extended period of time. The handwriting was immediately recognizable. William had seen his mother's handwriting his entire life, on birthday cards, on notes tucked into his school luggage, on small slips of paper she passed him during official engagements when she wanted to say something without saying it aloud. He knew the particular way she formed her letters, the slight leftward lean, the way her capital letters were larger than necessary, as if she were trying to give each important word a little extra space. He did not open the notebooks immediately. That detail is important. He sat with the box closed on the table in front of him for what witnesses described as a considerable length of time. Long enough that a staff member knocked to check whether he needed anything and was quietly turned away. Whatever was in those notebooks, William seemed to understand instinctively that reading them would change something, that there was a version of his life that existed on one side of this moment and a different version waiting on the other. He opened the first notebook. What he read in those initial pages was not, by itself, explosive. Diana wrote the way she spoke, directly, warmly, with a kind of urgent honesty that made everything feel immediate. The early entries in the first notebook dealt with her daily life in the palace during the period that royal historians have since identified as one of the most isolating of her marriage. She wrote about the rooms, about the silences, about the particular quality of loneliness that exists inside a building full of people who are all, in their various ways, managing their own silences. She wrote about the boys, William and Harry, small and boisterous, and entirely unaware of the architecture of tension surrounding them. She wrote about them with a tenderness that was almost painful to read, because running beneath it was the constant awareness that she was afraid. Not of any one person, of the system, of the institution, of the sense that the palace existed not to support the people inside it, but to protect itself, and that the people inside it were, ultimately, secondary to that purpose. This much aligned with what Diana had said publicly, in the interviews, in the documentary footage that William had seen many times over. She had not hidden her unhappiness entirely. But the difference between hearing her describe these things in a formal interview and reading the same thoughts written in private, for no audience, with no calculation, that difference was significant. Because the interviews were performances, however honest. The notebooks were not. William kept reading. The second notebook was where things began to shift. The entries in this notebook were written during a period that overlapped with the final years of his parents' formal marriage, the years when the separation was privately agreed, but not yet publicly announced, when Charles and Diana were still required to appear together at official functions while living, in every meaningful sense, entirely separate lives. Diana's entries from this period were sharper, less reflective, more immediate. She was clearly writing closer to the events she described, processing things in real time rather than looking back. And she wrote about Camilla. Not in the way that might be expected, not with the raw, dramatic fury that one might anticipate from a woman who had spent years watching her husband's affection redirect itself towards someone else. The entries were something more unsettling than that. They were precise, methodical, almost. Diana wrote as though she were building a case, not for any courtroom, but for herself, for her own understanding of what had happened, and when, and how, and why nobody in the institution around her had seen fit to warn her. She wrote about specific conversations she had been told about secondhand, conversations between Charles and Camilla during periods when Charles had claimed to be elsewhere. 3 times. She wrote about phone calls that staff members had mentioned to her, quietly, the way loyal staff members sometimes share information with the person they feel is being wronged. She wrote about a dinner that had been presented to her as a small private gathering of friends, and which she had later discovered had been arranged specifically so that Charles and Camilla could be in the same room without it appearing deliberate. She named names, not just Charles and Camilla, but the people around them who had facilitated these arrangements, who had known and said nothing, who had treated the whole situation as something to be managed rather than as a betrayal of a woman who had been left entirely in the dark. One name appeared in those entries that William was not expecting to see. The notebooks did not elaborate immediately. Diana's writing had a quality of controlled revelation. She would introduce something and then circle back to it later, as though she needed to approach certain truths obliquely rather than head-on. William would have had to keep reading to find out what this person's role had been, what they had known, what they had chosen not to tell her. He kept reading. The third notebook was the one that changed everything. Diana had clearly understood, by the time she filled these pages, that she was writing for more than herself. The tone shifted in a way that is difficult to describe precisely, but easy to recognize. The difference between writing to process your own feelings and writing because you want someone, eventually, to understand. She began to structure her entries differently. She included dates more carefully. She referenced specific documents, specific dates of official engagements, specific records that could theoretically be verified. She was building something. Not a weapon, exactly, more like a testimony. And the testimony she was building centered on a period that royal observers have long regarded as one of the most consequential in the modern history of the Windsor family. The months in which the question of Diana's future, her title, her access to her children, and her financial arrangements were being quietly negotiated behind closed doors, while the public divorce proceedings remained a matter of formal legal process. Diana had known, she wrote, that she was not operating on equal footing. She had known that the institution's resources were oriented against her in ways both visible and invisible. What she had not known, what these notebook entries revealed, she had only discovered after the fact, was the specific role that had been played by people she had trusted. She wrote about a conversation she claimed to have had with a senior member of the family, not Charles, someone else, in which she had been told, in language that was polite but unmistakable, that certain expectations existed for how she would conduct herself post-divorce, that her continued relationship with her children was understood to depend, at least in part, on her willingness to remain within acceptable parameters, that there were things she could say and things she could not say, events she could attend and events that would be considered inappropriate, ways of conducting herself that would be supported and ways that would be made difficult. She wrote this without bitterness. That was the most striking thing. The entry was analytical, almost, as though she had moved past the emotional response and arrived at a kind of clear-eyed understanding of the mechanics of the situation. She wrote about it the way someone writes about a system they have studied and finally understood, not with the shock of discovery, but with the particular calm of someone who has stopped being surprised. But then came the pages about Camilla. By this point in the notebooks, Diana's relationship with the subject of Camilla had evolved considerably from the earlier entries. She was no longer writing about her as simply the other party in a marital betrayal. She was writing about her as a figure who had, in Diana's understanding, played a specific and active role in the management of Diana's own situation. Not just as Charles's partner, as someone who had, at key moments, understood the political landscape of the royal institution and navigated it effectively, in ways that had direct consequences for Diana. Diana did not use dramatic language to describe this. She wrote factually. She referenced a specific communication, the nature of which she described carefully without naming the precise format, that she believed had been passed through Camilla's awareness before it reached any official channel. A communication regarding Diana's proposed public appearances in the period immediately following the divorce settlement. Diana's understanding was that this communication had been reviewed, that concerns had been raised about it, and that those concerns had resulted in adjustments being made to what Diana had been told she could and could not do. In other words, Diana believed that Camilla had been consulted about Diana's own constraints, that the woman who had been the subject of so much of Diana's pain had also, at some point, been positioned as a participant in managing Diana's future. She wrote one line that, by the accounts of those who have heard its contents described, William read more than once. She wrote, "She knew, and she said nothing to me, and perhaps that is the most honest thing that ever happened in this family, because at least it was consistent." William closed the notebook. He did not open it again for several hours. What happened in those hours is not entirely known. What is known is that by the time he returned to the notebooks, he had made a decision about what to do next. And that decision was not to quietly set the notebooks aside and allow the discovery to remain private. His mother had written these things down for a reason. She had kept them. She had, in some deliberate way, arranged for them to remain, perhaps not expecting them to be found so long after her death, perhaps exactly expecting that. With Diana, the line between intention and instinct was often impossible to identify from the outside. William reached out to someone close to him, not a lawyer, not a palace aide, someone who had known Diana personally and who had, over the years since her death, become one of the people William trusted to speak honestly about who she had actually been, rather than who the institution preferred to remember. The conversation was private. What came out of it, however, was a decision that had consequences that rippled outward in ways that were not, for a considerable time, visible to the public. Because William did not confront anyone directly, not immediately. That is important to understand about how he operates. He is, in this particular respect, his mother's son in some ways, and his father's son in others. He processes, he waits, he allows situations to develop to the point where he feels he has a complete enough understanding to act with precision rather than with emotion. The notebooks did not send him down a corridor demanding answers. They sent him into a period of quiet but methodical inquiry. He began asking questions that seemed, on the surface, innocuous. Historical questions, framed as a son trying to better understand the documented record of his mother's life. The kind of questions that any person in his position might reasonably ask as part of the ongoing effort to preserve Diana's legacy accurately. Questions about timelines, about which members of household staff had been present at particular moments, about the records of certain communications during the post-divorce period. The questions were received with varying degrees of discomfort by varying people. One person, in particular, was informed, through what can only be described as the royal family's informal network of people who know things and pass information quietly between themselves that William was asking, and that the nature of his questions suggested he had access to information that had not been expected to surface. That person was Camilla. The way this information reached her, and the manner in which she responded, was itself revealing. She did not immediately seek out a conversation with William. She did not ask Charles to intervene or to manage the situation. She did not reach for any of the official mechanisms that exist within the institution for exactly these kinds of sensitive moments. Instead, according to those familiar with the situation, she went quiet, specifically and notably quiet, in a way that people around her read as unusual. Camilla, by nature and by long practice, is not a woman who goes quiet. She has survived decades of extraordinary public hostility through a combination of patience, strategic visibility, and the particular skill of being present without being confrontational. She has attended events, made appearances, said precisely the right ceremonial things at precisely the right moments, and waited, always waited, for the temperature to change. She is constitutionally oriented toward engagement rather than withdrawal. So when she withdrew, people noticed. She canceled 2 informal engagements. She was described by those around her as preoccupied. Not distressed, exactly. She is far too controlled for distress to be easily visible, but preoccupied in the way of someone running calculations, figuring out, with the particular precision of a person who has spent a lifetime navigating a complicated institution, what the situation actually required of her. She was waiting to find out what William knew, and more importantly, what he intended to do with it. This is where the story becomes less about what was written in the notebooks and more about what their existence meant for the architecture of relationships within the royal family. Because Diana's words, preserved across 3 notebooks in a sealed box in a disused storage room, were not simply a historical record. They were a living document because William was alive to read them. And William was not, at this particular moment in his life, a young man still absorbing grief. He was a grown man, a father, increasingly clear-eyed about the institution he was inheriting and the history that had shaped it. He was a man who had spent years being told that certain things were simply how they were, and who had become increasingly unwilling to accept that framing without question. The notebooks gave him something he had never quite had before: his mother's account of events in her own words, without mediation, without the softening that occurs when grief is involved, without the institutional filter that shapes every official memory of Diana. He had the raw version, the version she had not trusted to anyone while she was alive. That the raw version implicated Camilla in ways beyond the obvious, beyond the affair, beyond the public knowledge that had long since been absorbed and processed and officially forgiven, was not something that could simply be filed away. Several weeks after the initial discovery, a meeting took place. The accounts of this meeting differ slightly depending on the source, which is itself interesting, suggesting that the people who were present came away with meaningfully different understandings of what had occurred, which is another way of saying that it was the kind of meeting where nobody said entirely what they meant. William and Camilla occupied the same space, at a family occasion that was not unusual in itself, and had a conversation that those nearby described as notably private and notably brief. William was calm. Camilla was composed. The conversation appeared, to anyone watching, to be perfectly ordinary, the kind of exchange that happens routinely between members of a large extended family at the dozens of gatherings that punctuate royal life. But people who know William well, and who were positioned to observe the interaction without being part of it, described a particular quality to his demeanor during those few minutes. Not angry, not accusatory, something quieter than that, and in some ways more difficult to navigate than either of those things would have been. He was looking at her, they said, as though he finally understood something he hadn't understood before. And she was looking at him as though she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time and had still, somehow, been caught slightly off guard by the reality of it arriving. She said something to him, not loudly, not dramatically, a sentence, perhaps 2, and whatever she said, and the accounts differ here too, which is perhaps appropriate, William did not respond with words. He nodded, in the way that someone nods when they want to communicate that they have heard something without confirming whether they have accepted it. And then the moment passed, and the occasion continued around them, and to anyone who hadn't been watching closely, it would have been completely invisible. But it was not invisible, and Camilla, from that moment, seemed to carry something she had not visibly carried before. The question of what she said to him, what she could possibly have said, is one that those close to the situation have been reluctant to address directly. There are a few theories. The first is that she acknowledged, in the oblique way that seems to be the royal family's preferred mode of addressing uncomfortable truths, that she had been aware of more than had been publicly known. Not an apology exactly. An acknowledgement. The difference matters enormously in the context of that family, where an apology would be extraordinary, and an acknowledgement is the closest thing that exists to one. The second theory is somewhat more complicated. It suggests that Camilla's response was less an acknowledgement and more a recontextualization, that she offered William some piece of information or perspective that placed Diana's entries in a different light, not to undermine them, but to suggest that the picture, as Diana had understood it, was incomplete in ways that were themselves explicable, that Diana, writing from inside a situation she experienced with enormous pain, had sometimes attributed intention where there had been circumstance, had sometimes read deliberate maneuvering where there had been the messier, more ordinary human chaos of several people making poor choices without a unified plan. This theory is, in some ways, more disturbing than the first, because it raises the possibility that the most honest moment of this entire sequence was not the discovery of the notebooks, but what came after. The possibility that William, having read his mother's account of events, was then given a version of those same events by the woman his mother had identified as complicit, and was left to sit with the question of whose account was more complete. His mother could not update her version. She was not there to respond to a recontextualization. The notebooks were finished documents, written by someone who was no longer alive to add pages. That is an extraordinary position for any person to be in. For a man who has spent his entire adult life balancing his grief for Diana against his obligations to a family and institution that existed in complicated relationship with that grief, it was something else entirely. Those who have spoken to William in the months following the discovery describe a man who has become, if anything, quieter on the subject of the past, not cold, not visibly distressed, but quieter in a specific way, as though he has arrived at a place in his understanding of his own history where the questions have not resolved but have settled, where he has accepted that certain things will never be fully known, certain accounts never fully reconciled, certain silences never fully broken. His mother kept secrets in notebooks. The institution kept secrets in its architecture. The people around her kept secrets in the spaces between what they said and what they knew. He is, in some sense, the inheritor of all of those secrets. And unlike the institution, which manages its secrets by keeping them sealed in boxes in storage rooms, William seems to have arrived at a different approach. He is not releasing the notebooks. He has not made their contents public. He has not used them as a weapon in any of the several ongoing tensions that exist within the royal family, but he has read them. He knows what they say, and that knowledge, that private, unmediated knowledge of his mother's understanding of her own life, has become part of how he moves through the world. There is something Diana would have appreciated about that, perhaps. She kept the notebooks because she believed that truth, even when it cannot be spoken aloud, deserves to be written down. She believed that there was value in documentation, even when the documentation might never be read. Or perhaps, more honestly, she believed that one day it would be, that the right person would find it at the right moment and would carry it forward in whatever way made sense given who they were and what they faced. The right person turned out to be her son. The moment turned out to be a renovation of a corridor in a palace where she had once lived, in a loneliness she described precisely and clearly in notebooks she sealed and hid and left for someone else to discover. The notebooks have not been destroyed. That much is known. They remain in William's possession, which means they remain in the story, as potential evidence, as private testimony, as the most direct line that exists between a mother and a son who lost her before she could tell him everything she wanted him to know. They sit somewhere in that gap between private grief and public record, which is the gap that Diana herself occupied for most of her life. As for Camilla, the woman who sat speechless, or close to it, when William's demeanor told her that he had read what his mother had written about her, her response to this period has been its own kind of revealing. She has not retreated entirely. She is too experienced and too determined for that. But those who observe her closely note that something has shifted in the way she carries herself, in William's presence specifically, a particular carefulness, a calibration that was not always there before, as though she is aware, now, that the ground she stands on has a different quality than she understood it to have. That there is a document in existence that contains an account of her, written in the voice of a woman the world loved in a way it has never quite loved anyone else, and that document is in the hands of a man who is in many ways the most powerful figure in the next chapter of the Windsor story. That is not a comfortable position to occupy. And Camilla, whatever else might be said about her, is too intelligent not to understand exactly what it means. The final detail, and it is the detail that no account of this situation has been able to fully resolve, concerns one of the passages in the notebooks that William apparently returned to more than once. Not the entries about Camilla, not the revelations about the post-divorce negotiations, something smaller, an entry that Diana wrote not about the institution or the politics or the management of her constraints, but about William himself. She wrote about a specific afternoon. She and William, young William, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, they were in a car together, just the two of them, which was already unusual enough that she noted it. She wrote that he had asked her, out of nowhere in the way that children do, why the people at the palace were always watching them. She had not known what to say. She wrote that she had told him, eventually, that some people's jobs were to keep an eye on things and make sure everything was all right. He had thought about this for a long moment and then said, with the directness that she described as his particular quality even then, "But who keeps an eye on them?" She wrote that she had not known how to answer that question, that she had thought about it for a long time afterward, that she found it, in some ways, the most honest question she had ever been asked about the situation she found herself in. And she had written it down, she said, because she thought he deserved to know that he had asked it, that even at 7 or 8 years old, he had understood something that the adults around him were working very hard to obscure. William read that entry. He read his own 7-year-old question, preserved in his mother's handwriting, held in a sealed box in a storage room for decades, waiting. Nobody knows exactly how that felt. He has not said. He may never say. But for those who have watched him in the period since the discovery, the way he speaks about his mother, in the rare moments when he does, the way he positions himself in relation to the institution he is preparing to lead, the particular quality of seriousness he carries about questions of transparency and accountability within the monarchy, there is a sense that the notebooks did not just tell him things he didn't know. They confirmed things he already understood. They told him that his mother had understood them too, and they told him, in her own hand, that she had believed he was the right person to eventually carry that understanding forward. Whether he does anything with it, whether the notebooks remain a private inheritance or eventually become something more, is a question that this story cannot answer, and perhaps that is exactly where it should rest. Not in a neat resolution, but in the ongoing question of what a son does with his mother's truth when that truth is inconvenient, complicated, partially corroborated, partially unverifiable, and written in a handwriting he would recognize anywhere. Some legacies are left in buildings and titles and institutions. Some are left in sealed boxes at the end of corridors the public never sees. Diana left both. William is the one who has to decide what they mean, individually and together. And that, in the end, might be the most Diana thing about this entire story. She found a way to keep the conversation going, long after anyone thought it could continue. The question of what comes next, if anything, remains exactly where she would have wanted it, open. If this story of hidden truths, royal silences, and the extraordinary weight of Diana's legacy is the kind of narrative you want to follow, the stories that the formal record doesn't contain, told in the way that only a close, careful watching of this family can reveal, then stay close. There is always more to this family than what appears in the official photographs. There is always another corridor, and somewhere at the end of it, very often, something that wasn't supposed to be found.